This conversation marks the 14th in a series we've hosted on various economic and business impacts of COVID-19. And today's conversation is going to delve into a different territory. And I want to emphasize that today's conversation is really a primer for some new material. So I'm going to encourage everyone to follow up with our speakers after the fact. This is just kind of a high-level overview, but I think should be a great conversation. So before I hand things over to our panelists, I'll give you a quick rundown of what to expect. We'll kick things off here shortly by having each of our experts share a few minutes of insights from their own individual areas of expertise. Then right about halfway through the conversation, right around 11:30 Eastern Time, we're going to transition to Q&A. And happy to field your questions. For reporters who are joining us via webinar, you are welcome to submit your questions anytime to us using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. For those joining by phone, you can email me your questions anytime at mackenzie_babb@Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand things off to our first panelist today, Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy Ph.D. candidate, Ajenai Clemmons.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie, and thank you everybody for being here. Again, my name is Ajenai Clemmons, and I'm going to speak both from my experience as a researcher examining the police-community relationship and my previous experience as a community relations ombudsman in an agency of civilians that monitored police and sheriff internal affairs investigations with the city and county of Denver. A good police-community relationship requires faith, trust, and confidence on the part of the community. And without that, police really cannot be effective, and public safety is compromised. In the United States, all or nearly all of uprisings led by Black people were catalyzed by some egregious incident of police brutality or killing that came after a series of alleged police violations that went unanswered. In heavily policed communities that are under siege from both high crime and oppressive policing tactics, there are three features that I want to focus on in our brief time together that are particularly damaging to the police-community relationship. The first is unpredictability. Departments often allow or even promote aggressive behaviors among some officers in quote unquote tough neighborhoods on certain shifts or with teenagers or other groups, and do a tremendous disservice to communities and frankly themselves. Officer unpredictability leads to civilian uncertainty. It becomes risky to trust police, to believe them, to cooperate with them, or to call on them in emergencies, all of which has a hugely negative consequence for public safety and leave people underserved. Second, clearly unnecessary and excessive force are devastating, and this leads me to this next harmful factor in the police-community relationship, which is rampant actions of domination and humiliation by officers. In addition to punching, kicking, and body slamming people or applying handcuffs in ways that are intended to inflict pain, some officers might threaten to jail a witness on Christmas Eve to coerce cooperation. In my interviews with men, some, because I do qualitative research, some spoke of being strip searched on the side of the road with their body parts exposed or pulled into vans to be strip searched. Academic research has documented officers performing genital and cavity searches in the back of their vehicles with such sexual violations occurring more often against Black women, especially if they are queer and poor. And the final behavior that I'll touch on today that is particularly acute in heavily policed communities, i.e. poor Black communities, is what's called extraction. And extraction often requires a punitive-minded city council and mayor to create ordinances that are virtually only enforced in these communities, such as spitting on sidewalks, jaywalking, or hanging an air freshener in your rearview mirror. And so those who least can least afford it are constantly ticketed and fined for flimsy violations. Then if people want to fight it, they may have to take off of work, causing them to lose money, take multiple buses to the courthouse, and wait in long lines. So effectively, they still lose even when they win. Extraction is the constant peppering of people with fines and fees, the confiscation of your car or family home when accused of using it to commit a crime. And that's before having your day in court. And the issuing of warrants for people's arrest when they cannot pay the fines. So I'll turn now to a handful of measures I believe municipalities can take to increase accountability. I'm going to talk first about what can be done on the front end before dealing with any particular case on the back end. This is a very short list, but I'm happy to add a few more in Q&A if you're interested. On the front end, municipalities should be reviewing their budgets. Reviewing the police budget to make sure that it reflects their new values. Are there perverse incentives that need to be eliminated? For example, are units incentivized to give tickets or make arrests for small infractions? Are units funded by seizing people's cars, homes, or other assets, especially before they've had their day in court? Also, departments should make sure that enough money is allocated in those budgets for officer training so that veteran officers can learn and implement updated philosophies. And second, review the use of force policies comprehensively. For example, most departments do not considering unholstering a gun or even pointing a gun at someone as a use of force. In a recent Medium article, I argue that all law enforcement agencies should consider unholstering a gun as a lower level use of force and pointing a gun as a serious use of force, and should mandate their officers report both. I outline a series of steps in that article that agencies should take to follow up afterwards. So they're not just tracking it, but it actually has some follow-up behaviors. Other low-hanging fruit for departments to target are policies that encourage recklessness, such as failing to restrict high-speed chases or shooting at moving vehicles, which is highly ineffective at stopping suspects, but very likely to injure or kill innocent bystanders. And nationally, thousands of lives have been saved by departments banning or curtailing such behaviors. And number three, chokeholds or any neck restraints should be banned. So-called carotid pressure techniques and other techniques that restrict airflow are inherently deadly uses of force, even though they are frequently not used in situations in which the officer's life is threatened or in danger. And the extreme disparities in when and against whom officers use chokeholds calls into question their legitimacy as a constitutional policing practice. On the back end, there is creating a comprehensive oversight system for handling complaint investigations and reviewing policies and practices. There are many kinds of civilian oversight agencies across the country, and doing it wrong can do more harm than good. So municipalities should be thoughtful about the agency they create. And I'm going to talk briefly about 6 critical components that will facilitate investigations that are fair, thorough, quality, and timely. Number 1, the agency must be independent. The reporting structure and the budget source should not be subject to the law enforcement agencies they are overseeing. Also, their posture should be neutral and objective, not advocates of either the police or the community. 2, the agency needs appropriate funding. It costs money to have sufficient staff with technical knowledge. Municipalities should not try to do civilian oversight on the cheap with a bunch of volunteers. You need lawyers, statisticians, people who can conduct investigations, and who can conduct robust outreach and relationship building within the community. Number 3, a civilian oversight agency should have full access to all aspects of a case. They should also be able to open cases themselves with no restrictions on their scope, the kinds of complaints they can accept, and they should have subpoena power. Number 4, agencies should be able to operate in real time rather than as an appeals process. This will help avoid poor investigation quality and untimely case resolution due to witnesses forgetting or moving and becoming unavailable. 5, the agency should have discretion to review training and police policy and issue findings and recommendations. Often the trends in complaints give rise to better understanding the underlying kind of policies and training that are leading to these complaints. And so it's good for them to be able to hit it at the source. And finally, the agency should have power. At the very least, the agency should have direct ability to issue regular reports based on data it has full access to from the police or sheriffs. In other words, it should be able to both command as well as project transparency. And with that, I'll now turn it over to Mr. Majestic Lane, Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief Equity Officer for the City of Pittsburgh. Mr. Lane will share how Pittsburgh and other cities are navigating this global social movement for racial justice and equality, particularly as it relates to community and economic development. So thank you for your attention.
And thank you. Thank you, Ajenai, for such an illustrative start for us to have this conversation. Always, talk about us living in a very, very unique time that we're living in essentially 1928, 1918, and 1968 all in the same year, which, has never quite happened, and how we respond to it is huge, really important. And for us, and looking at what's happening in our community, what's happening with social unrest as a result of state-sanctioned violence, and what's happening as a result of COVID and the impacts of the pandemic really are two sides of the same coin, because we both see structural impediments and structural violence and structural racism that's having a huge impact on how we really do our work and how we really proceed. And the new normal, and I think you've heard this term a lot in the last 4 months of what this means, but really what it means for us is we have a system that was designed to work exactly the way that it was. And it was being successful working that way. And there were winners and losers, and we all became comfortable with the winners and losers of that system. I think whether you look at the pandemic or whether you look at the social unrest because of police violence, you now see that there has to be a shift in understanding how society functions and how government understands that in relationship to the models that have happened prior. And so in Pittsburgh, like every other city in America, we have had to look at this shift and look at these two sides of the same coin of structural violence and structural racism, and figure out what is our way forward, given that many of the, as Ajenai spoke about, many of the conditions that were happening with communities because of disinvestment gave birth to this idea of neighborhoods being policed differently. So if the idea is, well, because these neighborhoods are suffering from disinvestment and then hence suffering from high crime, then you then have to utilize certain police forces to come in and subdue the community to make them okay. So it's all on the back end of a conversation around how do you really think about resolving the challenges in neighborhoods versus a proactive sense, and then getting to what the data really looks at as far as what's happening. For us in particular, in regard to this, and I'll get into the economic and community development components, one, we acknowledge that every case does not need police to come. And I think everyone knows that, but we, for generations, have been treating every situation of a 911 call like police have to come, when totally knowing that sending police to a home where a young person is arguing with their parents isn't really the best person to send. Sending a situation where someone's having a challenge around opioids or a challenge around homelessness isn't really the best thing. And because of the structural impediments, we know that often the people whose homes they're going to are often the folks we're talking about: Black, poor, queer, and just traditionally disinvested and vulnerable to systems. So we've identified that we have to shift. So we're creating in 2021 budget a Office of Community Health and Safety. And that Office of Community Health and Safety is really thinking about how we partner with our nonprofit partners to look at what kind of things can our nonprofit partners and folks in government actually work with police on engaging to minimize the amount of times that they have to engage in situations that often scar people and often set negative precedents for them when the police didn't have to be there. The other side of what we recognize is a deeper investment, and I think most cities and across the country are looking at this, a deeper investment in group violence intervention, or whatever they may call it in a particular city. And really what that's saying is that there's so much in the communities that can be engaged by folks in the communities that are trusted partners, really working with the youth and actually working sometimes in situations where to do conflict resolution, to deal with trauma resolution. And we know that those are people who are often closest to the situation. So how can we help and infuse resources into those programs to make sure that they're actually on the ground working with people and figuring out how can we minimize some of the roots of violence from that place, from kind of a prevention method, if you will. So those are two things that we will be doing, creating our community Office of Community Health and Safety, as well as deeper investment in preventative things. But we also know that some of these things are also caused, and especially now in this time of the pandemic, the broader structural challenges around economic development, community development. So as part of the Mayors for Guaranteed Income, one thing that Pittsburgh is doing is looking at the MGI pilot. And you may have heard about this from Mayor Tubbs and a set of mayors from across the country, but really looking at a base for populations, especially when we look at our consumer economy. We know people having money in their pockets, that they will make the decisions that actually stabilize their families. We know that they will make the decisions that actually help their communities, and we know they'll make the decisions that actually often keeps other institutions out of their homes and out of their families. So we're really looking at that as a base, because we understand more than ever that right now that, you know, families having access to resources and being able to engage in the broader economy is a really, really important part of what we need to do. We also know that a strategy around jobs, a strategy around what is the role of the municipal government, and really looking at creating opportunities for folks who may have been, who had lost their jobs or traditionally may not have been involved, frankly, in the workplace is becoming more important than ever. There's a model out of Philadelphia called Power Core that Pittsburgh we're looking to model this year in our budget that, again, transitions folks 19 to 25, or a lot of young people, again, who people would say would be in the quote unquote criminal justice system, actually to working in a municipal space and apprenticeships, to think about what is their pathway going forward and what is the role and responsibility of government to do that. So what you see in this time is a huge shift and a needed shift for cities to really acknowledge, one, with our role with state-sanctioned violence and making many of the changes that you see in many cities, and also shifting our budgets to reflect our priorities, but also to make sure that on the other side, we're doing the prevention and the appropriate intervention work to make sure that communities are safe, that people are whole, that people are healthy, which also works on the other side to reduce some of the incidences of ways that police have to engage in the community.
Thank you, Majestic, for those great remarks. I'm Nikitra Bailey. I'm with the Center for Responsible Lending, and I'm grateful for the opportunity today to join this discussion, and especially grateful to the UNC Center, Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise, and Mark Little for the opportunity. As I stated, I'm Nikitra Bailey, and I serve as an Executive Vice President at the Center for Responsible Lending. CRL is a research and policy advocacy organization. We work to stop predatory lending practices, and we really fight for financial fairness in the financial services sector. We're affiliated with Self-Help Credit Union, which has for 40 years provided access to credit in low-income communities and communities of color for families that have been traditionally shut out of mainstream banking. We are making every effort with our work to ensure that families are able to access safe and responsible practices so that they can build long-term wealth and sustain that wealth over some time. Our nation is facing a reckoning over structural racism. The inequality that it has produced is being exacerbated by the coronavirus. The COVID-19 pandemic is both a profound public health crisis and an equally profound financial crisis. The virus has devastated families across the nation and has fallen disproportionately on Black families. Systemic discrimination in the housing sector left Black families more vulnerable going into the 2008 housing crisis, and that crisis and the response to it left them worse off. This crisis is likewise hitting Black families hardest again, and the response so far is not equitable, nor is it sufficient. Most important, we have to address the long-term structural flaws that produce and perpetuate this inequality. So as I was mentioning, systemic discrimination in the housing sector really left families of color, especially Black families, really vulnerable to the impact of COVID-19. And the response to the foreclosure crisis thus far has not been equitable. And the COVID crisis, as a result of that, is really exacerbating wealth inequities in Black communities, because families of color have not had the same opportunity to build up home ownership and home equity in the same way that whites have. So they don't have the same economic cushion that white families would actually have to really help with the onset of COVID-19. So before COVID-19 started, we actually saw an increase, an upward trend in Black homeownership. It was actually moving away from some of the historic lows that had happened after the Great Recession, and it reached 44%. Without significant support, though, we're really concerned that these practices are no longer going to see an increase, but they are going to start to decrease. We also see tightening in the mortgage market. The market is responding by requiring borrowers to have 20% down payments and to have high credit scores, credit scoring over 700 points. We know that for many Black families, because they were not able to build similar levels of wealth through homeownership and the way that white families were, during the New Deal, white families were able to access federally supported mortgages with low down payments. Black families were locked out of those same opportunities. And in fact, only 2% of those first mortgages that went to Black families and other families of color in the first 35 years of that program actually benefited Black families. So these families show up at homeownership in a position where they're not able to have intergenerational wealth that allows them to tap into equity to kind of respond to what's going on in the COVID environment. We also know that wealthier homeowners at this time are counting on their home equity to really deal with COVID-related expenses. Again, if Black families were locked out of the ability to build up home equity and they don't have that cushion to weather financial emergencies, they're likely to have less home equity and weaker credit profiles. So many of these communities that have many Black households don't have the same housing appreciation as households in the suburbs. So what we see are Black communities being undervalued in comparison to white communities, and that is a direct reflection of redlining. Black families also are not able to really tap into this great boom of refinances and the kind of need to purchase larger homes at this time, again, because of being locked out and not having similar levels of wealth. So they're not in an equal position to benefit from today's really record-setting low mortgage rates. We also know that an impending foreclosure crisis could happen along with an impending eviction crisis. We need the Congress to act really instantly. There are reports that 1 in 5 renters are saying that they actually missed or deferred a rental payment in June. We know that 31% of Black renters are reporting this as well, which is twice the rate of white renters. And 13% of homeowners overall are saying that they've needed to defer a mortgage payment. And that's, again, 23% of Black homeowners saying that they either missed or deferred their home payment. And that's twice the rate of white homeowners, which is at 10%. So we need Congress to act. Congress has already responded with the CARES Act, which had a moratorium on evictions and also on foreclosures. However, that expired last week. So if we don't have any action, it's likely that millions of families, it's estimated that maybe about 23 million or so US families will fall behind on their rent. We know again that for many Black families, because they were shut out of homeownership opportunity, they are disproportionately renters. And even before COVID-19, families were paying almost 50% of their salary or close to 50% of their salary in rent. And for Black and Latino families, that was about 30%, and then 0.25% for all families overall. So we've got to be mindful that this kind of backdrop is not the result of people's action. It's the result of, things that are no fault of their own. People actually lost their jobs or faced reductions in wages because some governmental leaders took actions to really protect the whole society from the impact of COVID-19. We also know that many of the jobs that Blacks typically are employed in the service sector was hard hit. So that also drove those numbers and those figures down substantially. So we have to be mindful during this time that housing is an important pillar of our economy. It affects about 20% of the overall GDP. So we have to act, because any inaction right now will have the potential to really reverberate throughout every corner of the country and really put in a real lag on the economy overall and drag things down. So we need the House's bill, the HEROES Act, to be passed in the Senate, and we need the president to sign it immediately. There is $100 billion of rental assistance in the HEROES Act. If that legislation moves, we know that this crisis can be averted. We also need the HEROES provisions around homeownership protections. There's $75 billion in homeownership protections. We also need those protections to be enacted. Again, as I shared earlier, many Black homeowners and other homeowners are evidencing through their experiences an inability to continue to pay their mortgages because of the COVID-19 related impacts. And then we also have to make sure we start to really get at the structural discrimination that causes our economy overall. Discrimination targeted at African Americans, according to McKinsey and Company, counts about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. And we could see our GDP actually rise by 4 to 6 percentage points by 2028 if we actually address this discrimination. And then we have to take action to get at how those historic redlining practices have really disadvantaged Black communities and also other families of color. And what we need is a federal restorative justice GSE guarantee program where Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are taking proactive action to really increase the Black homeownership rate over the next 10 years. And then finally, we must fully enforce our nation's fair housing and fair lending laws. Part of the challenges that we face in the housing sector is the outcome of just lack of enforcement of very strong and powerful laws. We actually, as a nation, passed our first Fair Housing Act provision in 1866. That provision lasted for 102 years without any real enforcement until we achieved the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. That was the result of the life being lost in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So we actually have really effective tools in place that if we use them, we can root out this discrimination that's really dragging the economy overall. So at that point, I'll pause and turn things back over to Mark Little.
My name is Mark Little. I work here at the Kenan Institute as an executive director of CREATE, which is one of the affiliated centers here. It's a research and applied center that thinks about economic development, really focusing on places of economic distress. Our applied work focuses mainly on North Carolina and South Carolina, but through our research and partnerships, we investigate questions across the United States and globally. I also bring another perspective to the conversation today. I'm co-chair of Black Communities, a conference for collaboration, along with Dr. Carla Slocum, who's the director of the Institute of African American Research here at UNC-Chapel Hill. And so for the past 3 years, we've hosted international conferences that bring together scholars from a broad range of disciplines, as well as Black community leaders, again, from around the world, to figure out how we can work together to bring knowledge and practice in a very forward-looking approach to Black communities. I'll jump into some remarks here, but I just want to say that my comments are really a reflection of a lot of the applied work that we do here in the Carolinas, as well as information that we've learned in these partnerships nationally. So I think for Black people, Indigenous people, and Latinx people here in the United States, if we consider the health, economic, education, public safety systems, the outlook is unfortunately quite negative, as we've heard this morning. But for me, the question is it inevitable that COVID-19 will further entrench these devastating economic trends that, depending on how you cut them, have either been the past 30 years, the past 400 years, depending on who it is you're really talking about, or is it possible to chart a different path? And so I believe that to generate a radically different economic future for Black communities, Black businesses, economies, and people in particular, an understanding of the racialized history of economic policy in the United States is necessary. And just as one point to hopefully get us to that point that history is important, everything we've talked about, and we're really beginning with Ajenai's comments, is rooted in the Constitution, right? So there's this old document that we still think is important here in the United States. And so clearly, I think fundamentally, history of policy is important. And like I said, particularly for Black communities that have been here in the United States since shortly after Columbus decided to visit the Americas. So there are plenty of resources out there to understand the lasting economic impacts of the period of slavery and Jim Crow. Please check out the short bibliography that will be included with the Kenan Insight that's coming out later this week. But I do want to mention how more recent policies have piled on challenges for Black folks and have really shaped how we and many people of color more broadly understand their position within, I will say, America's apartheid. So desegregation, which is a major social public infrastructure process inspired by people like Rosa Parks and Derms and Atwater, in theory should have been unequivocally beneficial to Black communities. And urban renewable policies of the 1960s and 70s, again, in theory, should have benefited Black communities. Instead, in practice, these changes were too often opportunities to shutter Black schools, but not white schools, and Black institutions, erode Black professional class, disadvantage Black businesses, hinder Black wealth generation, and destroy community infrastructure. Just two examples. One is a construction of Highway 147 here in Durham, North Carolina during the 1960s that devastated the Hayti neighborhood, which displaced 500 Black-owned businesses. I think if today if we were talking about that there were 500 Black businesses in Durham, we'd be sort of pleased with ourselves. Similarly, Tulsa, Oklahoma's prosperous Black Wall Street, which was actually rebuilt after the devastation of the 1921 race massacre, was ultimately destroyed in 1970 by a federally funded highway project. So the speakers before me, and like I said, we'll get back to Nikitra, have outlined many ways in which all levels of government are addressing and could address this moment of compounding crises. I think the key here is for people, policymakers, and institutions which have been newly awakened to the ways in which racial hierarchy pervades economic, criminal justice, educational, and healthcare system. For these folks, please embrace a sense of humility and listen to Black activists, leaders, academics, and policymakers like we're fortunate to have with us today. And I literally do not mean myself, because I consider myself a practitioner and not an expert on many of these matters. All of these have key roles to play in re-envisioning Black economic futures. I'll just briefly mention two more responses to the economic dimension that have gained a lot of new momentum in this moment. So again, with the historical perspective, since the abolishment of slavery, there have been successive calls for Black reparations and for Black collective economy. There's two sides of a coin. The closest we came to both actually was immediately after the Civil War, when a group of Black ministers, actually led by a minister from Granville, North Carolina, they convinced General Sherman and President Lincoln to grant 400,000 acres of land from Charleston, South Carolina to Florida to be, quote, reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes, now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. So the response to this was overwhelming, but it was overturned by our dear President Johnson, who came after Lincoln. But just imagine what a different place we might be in had those orders stayed. It was a comprehensive and radical response to a comprehensive and radical structure that enslaved Black people for centuries. But since then, there have not been that level of actual response from the federal government to the issues that we are talking about that have compounded over decades. Much more recently, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act has been reintroduced into Congress every year since 1989. I think most recently in 2019, it was reintroduced as well. It is now receiving renewed attention. Proponents of reparations argued the US government owes compensation to the descendants of enslaved Africans for centuries of free labor and the economic impact of decades of racially discriminatory practices and the knock-on effects. Again, some of these have been discussed. And just to wrap this part of it up briefly, scholars have provided detailed enumerations of this debt and plans about how reparations could be executed. For example, direct payments, baby bonds, college tuition, commercial grants. More recently, a colleague of ours, Duke professor Sandy Darity, makes a case for direct payments as a primary mechanism and estimates total reparations on the order of $10 trillion. And so again, the problem with not addressing these issues when they come is that over time they compound, and then there's new policies, again, as the panels have been discussing, that add more and more to these disparities. And just to say, like, interestingly, over the past couple of years, this has become more part of the national conversation. And actually here in North Carolina, the city of Asheville just passed an ordinance that they called reparations. It wasn't quite reparations, but at least is a city unanimously actually passing a proclamation to attempt to address some of these issues. The other side of the coin, and this is the collective economy side of thing, again, from the historic perspective, most historic Black towns and settlements were founded by former enslaved people and were rooted in a dream of a life of an economic system that was safe from government tyranny and vigilante violence. These places were formed in the decades following emancipation, as well as historic Black commercial districts like Hayti and Greenwood and Tulsa. They also provided successful pathways to create wealth and a Black middle class. Their decline in prominence following the turn of the century is wrapped up in many of those macro policies from the federal government and state governments that we talked about. However, the social movement for Black justice has galvanized interest and efforts amongst Americans to, quote, buy Black, bank Black, recycle wealth within Black communities. And while the total value of Black-owned firms is small, and Black firms are disproportionately devastated by COVID-19, they are receiving new interest. And so there's quite a lot of Buy Black challenges, Blackout Day. Even Beyonce has a new collaboration with Black Owned Everything, and it's in a particular industry sector, but there is actually a really interesting kind of zeitgeist happening right now. And I'll just say from our perspective here, within the past 3 months, we've been approached by startups and economic development collectives from California to Eastern North Carolina that are inspired by the moment to pursue a wide range of activities from manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, large-scale commercial real estate projects, all based in this notion of Black collective economics.
So at this point, we're going to open things up for Q&A. I'll just remind all of our reporters who are joining us via webinar that you are welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I know that we have a number of researchers with us today as well, and we're going to get to as many questions of yours as we possibly can, but we are going to be giving priority to our reporter questions. Again, a reminder for reporters joining us by phone, you are welcome to submit your questions to me via email, Mackenzie_Babb@Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. Our first question comes from Danielle with the Charlotte Observer. How will the potential loss or reduction of the federal unemployment benefits impact the looming eviction crisis, particularly for Black Americans? Nikitra, I may toss that to you to start with, but open that up for the group after that.
Sure. What's happening is that extra protection is really helping all of the millions of families to actually continue to pay their rent. We're very close to the end of July and August 1. We know that many families are counting on that extra assistance to really help them really cover their expenses. So without quick and prompt action, it's likely that, more than 20 million Americans will face an inability to continue to pay their rent. And we also have to put this into context that many of these families are also struggling with their utilities. So those extra supports are necessary because local economies will suffer if families are not able to continue to pay their rent and also to continue to pay their utilities. And then the final point is we're experiencing spikes in COVID-related cases. So we continue to need to remain in place. Those renters need a home to remain in place. If we have unnecessary foreclosures and unnecessary evictions, we're not only going to see, more incidences of virus spikes, we're going to see a real taxing of our local services. Social services are already taxed and need additional resources.
Great, thank you. Majestic, please.
I'll speak. Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing, and I think what you're going to see across the country is that the resources that were there from the CARES Act was usually used to kind of supplement what happened in the beginning of the pandemic. And now we're getting to the August where so much is due. And so different cities are responding in different ways, some state resources, some local access to resources. But we know there's an eviction crisis forthcoming. And for us, what we've done is actually work with our housing authority to make sure that some of the hardest to house, that there's some eviction innovation. And we'll also have an eviction innovation project working with local magistrates and social service organizations, really trying to say, okay, you know what? Normally, the magistrate process tends to be very pro landlord. And how can we try to show some grace? How can we be thoughtful around the things that are happening with them now? So we have a model with two magistrates in our area, in our city, to try to really work with them and provide access to resources at the point where they're in the in the actual courtroom to be able to get some resolution. Again, acknowledging that it's necessary but insufficient, but also knowing that doing nothing, and just in case the federal government does not respond as fast, local and state and county jurisdictions, we're having to be really creative around thinking about the solutions. And that usually means a reallocation of resources to work with nonprofit organizations or to use the redevelopment authority to get resources out to folks like we do through our Housing Opportunity Fund.
Great, thank you, Majestic, and thank you, Nikitra. Our next question comes from Joe Killian with North Carolina Policy Watch and is for you, Mark. In discussing reparations, you said that reparations passed recently in Asheville don't really meet the proper definition. I'd like to hear you expand on that a little and perhaps share what other communities could or should be doing in this area beyond what was passed in Asheville.
Yeah, so I'll speak a little bit. So in terms of what was discussed in Asheville, my understanding that is primarily looking at current policies that the city has and trying to adjust them so they take care of their citizens moving forward in an equitable way, whether it's housing or other services that the city is involved in or provides. And that is absolutely a wonderful thing to do and a very good thing to do. I think the nuance here is kind of the difference between equity and justice. So, equity is like, okay, where are there inequities in the system and how can we repair those? How can we make sure that we're treating people actually equally moving forward? Justice means there's something bad that happened and you need to have a trial of some sort or some process to understand what happened and then make amends for it. And so that's not something that, in the case of reparations for slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, that's not something that a town of Asheville can actually even do. It's something that a federal government would need to do. Again, for those people who are talking about reparations in that way. And so it's a much larger thing. So I do think that what communities like Asheville could do is to pass the kind of laws that they are passing, but then also push for state and federal governments to consider, okay, these are things that we can do to move forward, but it's not going to actually address these huge wealth inequalities and a lot of the issues that Nikitra talked about in terms of credit scores. I mean, these are things that have built up not just with individuals, but within families over decades and over centuries. And so in order to address those kinds of things, it was going to take a much larger effort to it.
Thank you, Mark. Our next question actually is a follow-up also on reparations and touches on this similarly. In regards to reparations, do you think we will see more traction in policy adoption from local governments as opposed to a federal response? And if so, do you think there should be a standardized set of policies that communities seek to approve, or do you think that makes it harder to ratify these plans? And Mark, maybe you can start with that and then we can open it up for the group as well.
Yeah. So I think, in my remarks, one of the things I mentioned was a congressional act that's been introduced since 1989, I believe by Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas, and it's to study this, right? And so I think that something like that really needs to happen first. Again, if this is the path that we're gonna go down, I don't think that towns or even states trying to address these issues now will hinder from that. If anything, it will make it more possible that it happens. It'll get people talking about it more, thinking about what does this mean, and so yeah. So I wouldn't say that would be they're counterproductive at all.
Great, thank you. Another question on reparations. Mark, maybe you can start us off on this one as well. This is obviously a hot topic. Where should reparations begin and end? Should reparations be distributed just to the descendants of enslaved people, or does the distribution need to cast a wider net? Yeah,
and so let me just clarify my remarks. I'm trying to stay out of the sides on this. I'm just presenting things that people have proposed and I think we should talk about. So happy to talk about it in that context. Again, I'll just say I think the first thing to do is to study and see what happened and maybe think about putting a dollar amount on that. I do think that there are a number of other peoples and communities that could and perhaps should seek redress against not only the federal government, but potentially other governments in other countries. And so, I'll leave it there. I'll let some of the other panelists chime in if they have ideas.
This is Nikitra. One of the things that I think we have to look at is that wealth was really created based off of the free labor of formerly enslaved Africans. The nation made an intentional decision to build itself up and to really advantage white families off of that free labor. When we look at acts like the Homestead Act, 20% of white American families today can actually trace their family's wealth to that single act. It was an act that was supposed to allow for expansion across the United States. Well, formerly enslaved Africans were often terrorized in communities as far as places in states like Oregon, when they tried to take advantage of those opportunities. Mark talks all the time about what happened in Tulsa and communities like Rosewood. When we look at what happened in our New Deal housing policies, we know that those policies were drafted in a way to really respond to the Great Depression and to help our service members who were returning from fighting for our country's freedom. But at that time, we allowed those dollars to be distributed in a way that really locked Black families out. We know that, some estimates show that about 120 billion of federally supported dollars then, not in today's dollars, but in those dollars, were really a benefit to white families. So we have what we need to start a conversation about reparations, and we just need the moral will to do so. When you see these people-led protests, people are responding to the fact that they've been shut out, responding to the fact that there is no opportunity, and responding to the reality that the ideals of America have not been extended in the way that they've been promised. So I think instead of coming to this conversation around reparations with skepticism, we should come to this conversation all in. We have all the evidence that we need that African Americans and other people of color in this country have been harmed, and that people who are the descendants of those formerly enslaved Africans have continue to struggle in this society because of the way we use that free labor to build wealth, and then how we created public policies to continue to keep those communities out. So we just need to get to action.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nikitra, very much for that. Our next question kind of explores that a bit further. Given the negative effects of many of the policies that have been mentioned, and especially those that have affected the accumulation of Black net wealth, and you kind of started to touch on this, Nikitra, maybe just a deeper dive, are there policies that would take that into consideration with Black business owners when they apply for business loans? And if not, should there be?
So the federal government during this time, with the CARES Act, created what's called the Paycheck Protection Program. The way that program was set up, it was structurally designed such that large businesses could better benefit. We know that most Black businesses typically are very small business. We kind of refer to them at CRL as some of the smallest of small businesses. Because of the structural nature, they were shut out of the initial allocation. It was like $350 billion. So many Black business owners did not benefit from this real investment from the federal government to respond to COVID. So we all fought with our civil rights partners to try to work with the Congress and with the Treasury Secretary to really find ways to ensure that these small businesses could actually get access to some of the opportunities that they need. Chief among what we were pushing for was a $10 billion allocation, a set aside for community development financial institutions and for minority depository institutions, because these institutions have the greatest track record of ensuring that Black businesses are well served. We know that some of those resources have been allocated, but more still needs to be done. And to be quite honest, we are thinking that direct grants are needed at this level because so many Black businesses were shut out that, you know, many businesses had to ultimately close. So every measure needs to be taken from this point forward to make sure that those really small Black businesses that are pillars in our community, that actually employ a ton of residents in our community and keep our communities as viable economic engines, really get the resources that they need to sustain. Everyone thought that the COVID-19 crisis would be a very short-term phenomenon. It's proven to be very different. It's ongoing. We don't see the end to this, and we cannot lose important community infrastructure through our businesses to this crisis.
Just would add just a couple things on there. So we're still in the middle of this, so we don't know what the final numbers will look like, but it's anecdotal evidence is showing that the rate of Black businesses closing is twice that of the average, 40% versus 17%. So it's just to, you know, to Nikitra's point, I mean, that it's a crisis situation for Black businesses. Two signs of things going in the right direction, again, not from the federal level, but from foundations and actually private corporations. One is, I think it's Netflix has decided to bank with $100 million worth of their assets in Black banks. And to speaking to Nikitra's point about the relationships that Black banks have, or sorry, that Black businesses have with their lenders, those tend to be more community-oriented banks. And so building up Black banks and that infrastructure is another way to decrease all the frictions that Black banks have to getting loans and financial resources. The other one I'll mention is here in North Carolina, NC Idea Foundation has just committed to both increasing the number of dollars that they grant to startup businesses, but with a particular focus on Black-owned businesses. And so, again, these are not things that are going to address the entire issues that we're talking about, but in a lack of action on the federal level, these things do matter for some number of businesses and point in a direction that hopefully federal policymakers see and see that, okay, we need to be moving money into places that Black businesses can actually access.
Thank you, Nikitra, and thank you, Mark. Our next question comes from Vandana Ravi Kumar, who is joining us from Arizona. Vandana, thank you for waking up early to join us today. She's wondering if the panelists could elaborate on some of the disadvantages that Black business owners and entrepreneurs have historically faced and how those have been worsened by the pandemic. I know a few of you have touched on a couple of those examples, but maybe you could just elaborate further.
I'd say we know that the 7A program, which is the SBA program that the PPP is flowing through, we know that Black business owners hardly were able to access business loans even before COVID. And the fact that we would create a program to funnel through there without giving foresight to the reality that structurally it was already a place that was challenging for Black businesses is something that has to be taken into consideration. Right now, there remains about $100 billion left in the PPP. There's talks that the Senate is interested in possibly ensuring more funds are allocated. So again, let's be proactive and creative and make sure we get to these businesses what they need. The PPP was set up so that businesses could actually keep their employees and continue to help keep some of these employees off of our state unemployment rolls, and to ensure that there was income continuing for families and for these employees. So again, we know that structurally, these small businesses have not historically had the best relationships with banks. And the initial allocation of the program funds, it was structurally designed that they could not be first in line. So the more wealthier businesses were first in line. So let's do something this time that really gets at those businesses and, you know, doing direct grants to those businesses, maybe direct grants of about $100,000 or less, because we're talking about some of the very smallest small businesses to really help them sustain during this time, especially because COVID is ongoing. And again, these businesses operate as pillars in our communities. And without them, major economic flow in communities all across the country that have a high proportion of African Americans will be impacted, and we don't need to see any more economic downturn.
What I would say is that briefly what we see in communities has been talked about is relationships to banks. Relationships to large banks are things that a lot of our businesses don't have. And when a lot of our smaller banks and the CDFIs either didn't have access to the money or the interest levels and the things that were going on were really high, what we had to do as a government was actually shift our resources over to our redevelopment authority and put money into the community in the form of convertible loans, 0% interest convertible loans, which we know many of them they're not going to be paid back. They end up being grants. And what we found was that many of the people coming to our redevelopment authority for these convertible loans were smaller Black and smaller women-owned businesses, because many of the larger businesses we're talking about were able to connect to the PPP through their lenders and through relationships that they had. So you even kind of see the structural benefit that many of the companies have, where they were able to get access to PPP, where a lot of the Black businesses were not. So they, fortunately, we were able to redirect resources to our redevelopment agency to be able to give them a lifeline of sorts, to be able to survive in that short time and be able to try to hold off along with some other state grants. But you do see that. So what we had to do was actually what amounts to putting direct money on the street. And if some people did loans back, that's fine. But we acknowledge that because of the structural racism and the structural influence, they were not actually able to even get to the PPP. So we're seeing that as a huge part of whatever comes in the second act, be it when the Senate and the House gets it together. It has to be something that is more streamlined and more equitable in a way that it gets to the community.
And if I could just add a couple of really quick things, just kind of, again, looking a little historically. So I mentioned the impact of urban renewal policies in the 60s and 70s on Black neighborhoods in larger cities and in Black business districts in those places. And so that had the effect of literally displacing and destroying the infrastructure around Black businesses. Second, on the ag side, during the Clinton administration, the federal government settled an enormous lawsuit with Black farmers across the South who had been discriminated against loans from USDA for decades. If you look at Black land ownership after the end of the Civil War, is about 14% of land in the United States was owned by African Americans. Now it's under 1%. And so these are areas where it's around capital for loans or land, that there's been policies, very specific policies, that have removed wealth or destroyed Black attempts at generating wealth.
Well, thank you, panelists. I know that we are right at time, and so we're going to wrap things up here. I just want to thank each of you again for sharing your insights and for such a thought-provoking conversation. On behalf of the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise and our co-host today, the Institute of African American Research, I just want to again emphasize that while we know that Black Americans have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 and Black businesses the same, this conversation is really the tip of the iceberg. So I would encourage you, I know we didn't get to all the questions in the queue today. I would be more than happy to set up follow-on conversations with any of our panelists. Please feel free to be in touch with me. I really encourage all of you to continue the conversation. Thank you again for tuning in. We'll be meeting again in a few weeks to discuss another aspect of the business and economic impact of COVID-19. Until then, stay safe, stay well, and take good care. Thanks for joining.